So first of all, before I welcome you, I just want to remind everyone, first of all, this session is being recorded. It'll be posted at businessanthro.com. And there's, of course, a chat and a Q&A. And what we'd like is if you have something you'd like to chat about, put it in the chat. If you have a question, either Julia or Matt will read it. Julia will actually be tracking the chats, and Matt will be tracking the Q&A. And of course, we know that people don't pay much attention to that. So if you have any questions, just put them in there, ideally in the Q&A, but we understand that you may want to chat otherwise. So I want to introduce Gillian very briefly. If you don't know who she is, although I suspect that you signed up for this because you do, you know that she chairs the US editorial board of the Financial Times. She's also written several books that have received acclaim globally. And she also happens to have a PhD in anthropology. Of course, the happens to have, I think, started before the journalism, at least based on the history that I know. And then she quickly came to her senses and realized that she could speak to more people and get more people to listen as a journalist than as an academic. And that brings us to her book. I love the book, Gillian. I think probably everybody here who signed up for the session either love the book or will love the book if they once they read it. And so what I'm going to do, and what Julia and Matt will do when they chime in, is to ask questions that are a little less common of the ones that you've been getting in the mainstream media, because this is an audience of people who are interested in business anthropology. Very often they're practitioners, some of them are academics. And so they want to hear everything you have to say that is either in the book or not in the book.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start off with something that intrigued me, and it was this is sort of a nod to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which was discredited about 2 minutes after anybody started talking about it, but I'm going to like it anyway. And what I'm thinking about is that you use a lot of linguistic handles in your book. The title itself, Anthro-Vision. You talk about Anthro-Vision versus funnel vision. You talk about worm's eye view versus bird's eye view. You talk about looking around versus looking at a compass. And there are so many of these. And what we're wondering is, when you use phrases like this with people that you know in business, how well are they received? Does it help them understand what you're really trying to get to better than the way anthropologists tend to talk about what we do?
Well, I mean, the book was written because all my life I've had the people who I speak to as a journalist essentially asking me, how come you're so weird? Because, anthropology for most non-anthropologists is basically about being Indiana Jones for academics. It's about going off and having a wacky, weird, exciting time and doing things that make amazing cocktail party conversation, but don't actually have much point to them or much relevance. So one of the things I've been trying to do all of my career is explain to people why and how the insights of anthropology matter. And the financial crisis of 2008 was really the first time I sort of came out from the woodwork and said, I am an anthropologist, because that was a period of time which showed business people very clearly why the models they'd been using to predict financial markets and work out how economies worked based on very crude visions of physics and applied to human behavior, why that was wrong. So after that 2008, I got a lot more questions about anthropology, more interest. And I think more recently, populism, shocks like the COVID shock, the rate of change that's happening as a result of technology, climate change, all of those issues are prompting a recognition amongst business leaders and financiers and policymakers that the 20th century tools that we use to navigate the world, which tended to be marked by tunnel vision, they tend to be defined by the boundaries of what you put into the model and you ignore everything else, those don't work. And as people start to realize that, I think there is more interest in social science. It tends to be interest in psychology or sociology, not anthropology. But what I try and do is tell people, listen, anthropology is about trying to understand the context. It's about trying to understand the big picture. It's about trying to understand all the cultural stuff that you ignore. It's about trying to see around corners. And what I often increasingly tell people these days is anthropology is about trying to, not just see around corners, but it's about risk management in a funny kind of way. And when you say that anthropology is about risk management, that really gets people's attention.
Interesting, because when I was asking about the handles or the phrases that you use, what I was getting at was when you speak to business people, as I have done for many years myself, is that they like easy to understand phrases. Of course, they love acronyms. But for example, looking around as opposed to looking down at a compass. One of the reasons I love that so much is because it can shock them into thinking about anthropology in a way they haven't thought about anthropology before. And so I think, when I read the book, I got a sense that you could really be communicating to them in ways that they haven't been communicated with before.
Yeah.
And have you had any feedback on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you're trying to do as a journalist is try to take a mess and morass of information swirling around and find quick, snappy ways to communicate it. I used to run what's called the Lex column on the Financial Times. And a lot of my role was to try and think of really short, sharp, snappy headlines that would quickly capture people's imagination.
Right.
And that's what I've been doing most of my career. It's in some ways is what anthropology does, but anthropologists tend to be very bad at capturing short, sharp, snappy phrases. And it really matters. I mean, I often say that the point where people began to understand what was going on with the financial crisis and actually act was when basically people invented the word shadow bank for the financial system. So, having an image or a phrase or something like that really helps.
So you mentioned psychology. You mentioned sociology. A lot of people in business know what those are. They know what they do. They don't always know what anthropologists are or what we do. You mentioned Indiana Jones, for example. That's easy for people. Maybe some people who are a little older have heard of Margaret Mead, but a lot of them don't know. And one of the things that struck me when I was reading the book is that you bring in a lot of anthropological methods and ideas, ethnography, cultural relativism, semiotics, and so on. And of course, you talk about culture and the concept of culture. The question that I found myself asking is, are we as anthropologists operating in business limited or hurt in any way because we don't have an overarching theme or an overarching idea other than culture, which can be hard to explain to people in business? They think they know what it is. The way you talk about weird, or the way you talk about, I'll leave it up to the readers of the book to find that. Even Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of need, that very simple models. Is culture it, and does it work for us? Can we do it? Is it antithetical to the way we work to have one overarching idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the problems is that culture is something that is incredibly slippery to talk about. It's like, trying to chase soap in the bath. And on the one hand, everyone kind of vaguely knows it matters, but on the other hand, it's almost impossible to define. It's highly, highly politicized today. Because if you start talking about culture, you start getting into all these issues about racial justice. Anthropology has a very convoluted past in terms of talking about culture. And so, you spend a lot of time trying to explain to people that culture don't exist as boxes, is a spectrum of difference. And that we as anthropologists, basically uphold that spectrum of difference. And we as anthropologists try and argue that culture matters enormously in terms of shaping who we are, but we're not trying to be cute and crude about how we define it. And that's a tough thing to communicate to people. In some ways, psychology did it better. People like Danny Kahneman, with his framing, thinking fast and slow, explained to people quickly that the way our brains work matters, but you can't necessarily boil it down into quick, simple, easy, cute phrases, but you can actually try and create a framework, as he did, about fast and slow. And I think anthropologists need to do that much more in terms of trying to create a framework that quickly communicates to people why these things matter.
So speaking of kind of frameworks or kind of common ways that people think about us, so they do think about culture associated with anthropologists oftentimes, even if that's not the best way to explain it. But another one is simply that maybe we do research. But we can do much more than research, as the book points out along the way. And
Mm.
so, what could we potentially do to advance ourselves into other roles, strategic, leadership roles, roles that help us get a seat at the table and really influence decisions? What kind of skills do we need?
Well, I write in the book, I address the question about why there aren't more anthropologists in policymaking roles in a more visible way, and why anthropology isn't there with economics in the policy debate. And, I think part of it's due to the structure of the anthropology profession, and if you like, the personality of anthropologists, because to be a good anthropologist, you have to be pretty humble and patient and ready to make yourself invisible to observe others. And you tend to see life in multiple shades of gray, not black and white, all of which are really attractive features and probably the best way to try and understand the world. Because guess what? The world is multiple shades of gray. It's not black and white. And the world is desperately lacking people who have empathy for another point of view. But if you have those traits, you're probably not going to be hardwired to want to grab a microphone and stand in the middle of a platform and yell at everyone else and say that you have all the answers to everything. And anyone who studies power for a living is often very cynical about power structures. So anthropologists often are very wary of going to work for big companies or governments or places like that. Anthropologists tend not to be natural people who hustle hard, which may be one reason why A, I'm not an anthropologist in academia anymore, but B, some anthropologists have often told me they don't like what I've done. They feel that I've boiled the concepts down into too much simplicity. So I think that's one really big problem with trying to get anthropologists into the mainstream. And the other is communication. That it's hard to communicate these concepts if you are devoted admirably to talking about shades of grey. And then the other problem, of course, is that academia doesn't let you toggle very easily. And so although you do have economists who go back and forth between working for the government and working in academia, there's a whole slew of economists who've done that. You've got a few behavioral psychologists and sociologists. There aren't many anthropologists who've done that, partly because the academic tribe of anthropologists tend to be very, very wary, if not cynical, about outsiders.
Now, so building on that a bit, in the book, you talk about anthropological intelligence and kind of as if, let me say, these other disciplines, they have their frameworks, they have their way of speaking that helps them communicate that they have the ability to solve problems. We have struggled with that at times. Now, your book is advocating for anthropological intelligence, which is, one way of saying that we have a solution to solve these problems. But it also might bring up the question, what can that not do? What are our own blind spots and how might we see those silences, if you will? And how can we be cognizant of maybe what our limitations are?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not actually arguing that anthropology is the answer to everything at all.
Sure.
I'm more arguing that it's a very good complement. It's a very good check and balance. It helps with risk management. It helps set things in context. And so one of the things I argue in my book is a world of anthropology intelligence needs a second type of AI. A world of artificial intelligence needs a second type of AI, anthropology intelligence. Economics can benefit by having anthropology with it. So can medicine, so can law, so can public policy making, so can many aspects of corporate behavior. Anthropology has been weak at working with business or government or policymakers. It's been weak at embracing quantitative research methods. I know that, and I say that myself. I'm as guilty as anyone because I never got trained in any quantitative skills at all. I can't code, and I feel, much at a disadvantage as a result. Anthropology has been poor at sometimes recognizing the need to work with other academic disciplines inside academia. I mean, sometimes anthropology, has a tendency to become quite tribal and introverted itself. So all of those problems are definitely there in anthropology. It's not unique to anthropology. All academic disciplines have them. But I think that anthropologists need to kind of stop for a moment and ask, what is their relevance? Because, the discipline started, to be honest, as a large tool of a imperial Western culture, which was interested in classifying other people in a fairly often racist way, in an evolutionary model which, was understandable given the time and the moment in history they were coming from. But that was kind of what the role of anthropology was. In the 20th century, anthropology instead became almost a tool of anti-imperialism. It became a beacon of tolerance, cultural relativism, and trying to really stand up for this idea that humans are all equally fascinating wherever they are, and they all need to be studied with a sense of respect and understood, and that will enrich us all. That lesson is still very, very relevant for the 21st century. But if I had a sort of clear-cut mission for anthropology today, it's really about trying to make sense and frame all of the incredible technologies to do with the internet and other sort of technological innovations that are changing what it means to be human, and trying to ensure that a world that is both incredibly globalized and tightly connected as a system to a point where we're all exposed to contagion from each other all the time, trying to make sure that that sort of interconnected system where we're exposed to contagion actually has mutual understanding going hand in hand with it, because right now it clearly isn't. And so right now we live in a world that's worst of all systems, where we're both tightly integrated and exposed to each other, but nobody understands each other, and most people aren't even bothering to try. So I think anthropology has an incredibly valuable mission right now, and I just hope that all anthropologists are willing to stand up and shout it, and can see that actually working for a company, working for government, working in a practical way doesn't mean us selling out the mission necessarily. It just means a slightly different mission, and have encouraged ways of trying to toggle in the future. That's my own thought.
So I'm just going to build on this theme a little bit, and it's really fascinating to hear you develop it, Gillian, here in this conversation and in the book. In the book, you also talk quite a bit about your own kind of personal dirty lens, as you've described it, and the different ways in which you had to overcome some of your own personal biases in your work as an anthropologist, but also in your work as a journalist. And I wanted to ask you to kind of continue to build on this conversation. Can you talk a little bit more about, you already mentioned some of the biases that, anthropological biases, I would say, that hold anthropologists back from succeeding in business. How can anthropologists overcome those to be successful in business settings and to be impactful in these environments? And a kind of related question, what would it take for our business to embrace anthropology in a larger way, including...
Yulia, I think Yulia, you're quite faint, and I couldn't quite hear the first question.
Okay, my speaker is giving me a little bit of a problem. So if you're having issues hearing me, thanks for letting me know, but kind of give me a thumbs up maybe to speak up even louder if it's necessary. So I'm going to restate what I said. My question in a nutshell is, I want to ask you to kind of elaborate further on some of the biases that you think are holding anthropologists back from succeeding in business. Not just the biases on the side of anthropology, but as a lot of anthropologists are in fact transitioning into professional roles in business settings. What is holding people back in being more kind of recognized as anthropologists and in these kinds of environments? And how can we maybe overcome some of these biases as anthropologists contributing to industry, so that our impact is much more recognized?
Well, I think the biases against anthropologists is very simply that we are a group of hippy-dippy people who are either, anarchist revolutionaries, or basically Indiana Jones, or both. And that we can't work with companies, we're not relevant, we talk with endless jargon, we're slow moving, etc. And I think if anthropologists want to counter that, they probably need to learn their 101 lesson from their discipline. We need to, and to take on board the clothes of whoever we're trying to talk to and engage with. Learn the mannerisms, the language, the performance rituals, etc., etc., and work with that system rather than against it, to talk with what people would regard as credibility. Now, I know that some anthropologists regard that as a sellout. I know some people don't want to work for companies or governments in a position of power, and I completely understand and respect that. It's a personal decision. But if anthropologists want to be effective, that's what they have to do. And frankly, I have, in my own career, as part of me, being able to stalk around the corridors of power and see what's happening inside the system and see what's happening, inside, central banks and governments and CEO suites and all that kind of stuff, which is what I do as a journalist. I have to play the game. I have to, go along to Davos and do all the things that go with being on Davos and talk the talk, walk the walk, be part of that system simply to have a chance of being taken credibly. Now, I'm not pitching myself as an anthropologist. I'm pitching myself as a journalist first and foremost. But I think that if anthropologists want to be taken seriously, that's what they have to do. And I should stress that, some are doing it, and I salute them, with great respect. They really are. I mean, Bob, you've been doing this for years, talking to companies. There are many, many examples of, anthropologists who've been doing amazing work. And I try and highlight that in the book, which actually, another reason I wrote the book was partly to highlight all the ways that anthropology is offering incredible insight in a very practical way that most people don't know about.
So I want to pick up on that. I think your book is a great, either it's a Bible or an encyclopedia, or simply a reference book for people who work in business, or anthropologists who are dealing with hard-nosed business people, quants, techies, who just are skeptical of what we do. And they can take your stories and they can tell those stories. And maybe they can tell some of their own stories too, and that'll help them make the case. Your book, of course, being from their perspective, a third party, can help them make the case. But one of the things that I wonder about, and I've been doing this for a while, as you said, is that to some extent, all qualitative research is subjective. It can be anecdotal. It can be somewhat impressionistic. And so the quants and the techies might look at us and say, I can test that conclusion. I'm not quite sure I believe it. Sure, you saw it, but I don't know if I would see it. What are your suggestions, aside from great storytelling, or maybe that's the answer, to help overcome that with some of the kinds of people that you and I have met over the years that are a little bit skeptical of all of this?
Well, I think one reason why I think it pays to talk about checks and balances, risk management, tunnel vision to lateral vision, all of those frameworks I think are the most effective. If you go in there and say, I want to talk to you about culture, people who are trained in hard sciences, quantitative science, would probably do an eye roll and go, well, what's the point of that? Because this awful, terrible double-edged meaning of culture in the English language, which means both kind of paintings and art and going to the opera, and it means the stuff that shapes the way we behave. And the fact it means both means that it can be completely misinterpreted, but also very easily denigrated by people trained in hard sciences. One of the stories I didn't tell in this book, but which came out of a speech I gave recently to an AI conference, artificial intelligence conference, I think that captures the essence of the book, is that I'm told by AI programmers, there's one thing that no AI platform has ever managed to do, and that is to tell a good joke, to invent a good joke. And the reason for that is actually quite important because for two reasons. Firstly, what jokes do, and I talk about this in the book in relation to private equity and Daniel Salulis's fascinating study of private equity. There's a wonderful paper called something like Don't Mix Paxil and whatever, Viagra or something. And he talks about the jokes that private equity players tell at conferences. And, he makes a point that jokes define social groups. You have to be in a social group to get the joke, have a shared cultural understanding. But there's never a hard and fast rule about who's in and who's not. It's not like being a member of a club. And because, big data, AI platforms basically work off big data, of hoovering up massive information about what we're doing. It's hard to define the edges of those networks and groups sometimes. But secondly, jokes operate by playing off different layers of cultural meaning, contradictory elements of our culture, because our cultural patterns are never entirely consistent, rational, like a sort of math equation. You can't summarize culture with a math equation as such, no matter how much you want to accept Levi-Strauss and structuralism and stuff like that. It's always contradictory. It's never neat. It's always messy. And the other key thing is that jokes operate on the basis of silences, what people don't talk about. And one of the problems with, I say, big data collection is that not only does it tend to take a static snapshot of the world as it existed in the immediate past or the further past, it doesn't necessarily track silences, what people don't talk about, what they don't do. And it can't really necessarily track its contradictions that easily. So for all those reasons, explaining how a joke works to a computer and predicting a joke or why it's funny is hard. So that's the kind of story I think that communicates to techies and quantitative people that, AI and big data can understand so much in the world, but having that additional second AI, anthropology intelligence, to put it into context, to act as the ethical buzzer, to provide, if you like, the reality check, that I think is a more practical way of trying to do it. And last but not least, anthropologists can actually give indications about what big data could or should be studying in the first place as well. I tell the story in the book about a Danish pension fund who'd only ever used quantitative analysis to make sense of the customers. And then when they brought the anthropologists in, they realized that why some of the signals they were getting just didn't quite make sense, but they were ignoring it. So it's really about twinning that perspective, in my view.
Yeah. And I like the idea of course, acknowledging the contribution that the quants and the techies make and the value of what they do, and saying this is a very different perspective. I think that helps a lot. I think that the specificity of the stories makes all the difference, as you said. And talking about humor is a wonderful way of doing it because everybody can get that on some level.
Yeah, and I think there's one other story I tell in the book, which I think is also relevant, which is about the problem with Facebook. And one of the things is that a lot of the big data analysis that's been used in the consumer goods industries has been, and that's in fact advertising, has essentially assumed that humans are isolated individuals, and you can look at them purely in terms of how individual brains work through psychology, and that you can look at those patterns in that way. And so if you look at, say, the kind of analysis that drove Cambridge Analytica when they were using the Facebook material, they were hoovering up data points about what people were liking on Facebook, right, and then trying to extrapolate from that, looking for correlation of patterns in terms of their political behavior. And the idea was that, if you liked somebody's hat or liked a sports team or liked something like that, then you were somehow indicating a psychological bias in your own individual brain, which could then be equated to where your political leanings would go. And as it happens, and I tell this story in the book, there's a guy called Nigel Oakes who was a part of the group that originally founded Cambridge Analytica, who later split with Alexander Nix, who created Cambridge Analytica itself, for many reasons. But one of them was that he thought this idea of using individual data points on Facebook likes to predict trends was ridiculous, because not only do individuals not act as individuals, but as groups, they all interact with each other. But the example he gave is that, if I say I like your hat on Facebook, it doesn't mean I actually like the style of the hat usually. It may be, but it's actually probably because I like the relationship I have with you. And it's very hard, again, for a computer to tell, or for someone looking at raw big data to tell, whether they're liking the relationship or the hat, and how that actually impacts on things. So yes, it could be correlation, but correlation isn't causation. I should stress that none of that's meant to in any way, shape, or form indicate I supported what Cambridge Analytica did, because I didn't. And I try and expose in the book about some of the terrible things that happened there. But it gives a sense about the perils of assuming that individual psychology of the sort that consumer industries are fascinated by is the be-all and end-all.
So I'm just gonna again build on this theme. So as you were just saying, in the book itself really makes an excellent case for why or how anthropologists can help business executives really understand the larger kind of cultural context of their consumers, or of users, if it's in a tech setting, of buyers more broadly, but there's also an opportunity, as you start to talk about more towards the end of the book, to help businesses also recognize culture in a different way. That businesses are more open to embracing anthropology as a tool that helps them understand social context, cultural context, they're less likely or are less willing yet still to see themselves as participants in a cultural environment, and even as producers of culture in kind of larger sense. And interestingly enough, we're hosting this conversation only a couple of weeks out from Jeff Bezos's flight to space, where he, gave a thanks to his customers as well as to his employees for helping to fund this mission as he saw it. And of course, he was widely kind of panned for that note of gratitude, because it just seemed so not only tone deaf, but completely disconnected from the wider environment in which his own business functions. So I wanted to ask you kind of to build on some of the conversations that you've started in your book about ESG, but also to ask, how can we use Anthro-Vision, or how can you maybe kind of see or suggest that we think about this moment and elevate and leverage this moment to kind of encourage businesses to embrace Anthro-Vision as a necessary tool, right, that goes beyond also these questions of environment, social responsibility in governments, but as a kind of larger way of helping companies recognize their own role in the system.
The fundamental premise of the book is that, there's three parts, I think, to anthropology: making the strange familiar, i.e. trying to immerse yourself in something different to understand it, which any company has to do in a globalized world. Never mind if they don't have to go overseas to do that, because anyone needs to understand how customers, different people are operating or thinking. Secondly, to flip the lens and use a different perspective to look back at yourself and make the familiar strange. And then try to think about social silences. Think about the world, parts of the world that you don't talk about, that other people don't talk about, all of the things that are hidden in plain sight. And when you start looking at things which are hidden in plain sight, when you look at things that are actually not in the model, they're not discussed endlessly in public, they're not on the balance sheet, they're not in the big data set, then you start stumbling over all this stuff which companies have been ignoring forever, particularly in the era of Milton Friedman, like the environment, like social rights, like the provenance of a supply chain, all the stuff that gets swept out under the carpet. And after I finished the manuscript and sent it in, and we decided the title of the book, a friend of mine said, actually, it should be called Hidden in Plain Sight, because that's really what the book is about. I wish I'd used that title, it would be much better. But, Hidden in Plain Sight is something that companies have recently woken up and realized that they can't ignore. Because, being hidden in plain sight is what was happening in companies around the hashtag #MeToo scandals. And companies ignored it until it actually felled the CEOs. Being hidden in plain sight is basically what's been happening with the environmental footprint of companies. And they could brush it away until suddenly a company like Enron loses, Exxon, not Enron, Exxon loses, some of its board members. Being hidden in plain sight is what happens in supply chains until suddenly there's a huge scandal and suddenly people are dealing with that and investors start leaving. So I think that the key to talking to companies, to go back to Bob's original question, is to talk about risk management and looking at what's hidden in plain sight. And that leads naturally to many of the themes in sustainability. It leads naturally to the themes in anthropology. And I think, again, anthropologists have kind of missed a trick sometimes in the past by not recognizing that connection and the degree to which they can actually present their perspective on life as a tool to help companies have that broader vision. And I think companies do want that today. I should stress, because they have suddenly all been converted and got a halo to the idea of being moral and good in society. Although some CEOs do want to do that, but simply for reasons of self-defense and risk management.
You speak of a few silences in the book. AI is one that's particularly is important to me, given that I work in tech. But I'd be curious, given your position in the world, you have a unique position to many of us. And so is there any silences that you are worried about right now that you're starting to see bubble up that maybe you didn't have the opportunity to put into the book? And is it anything that people on this call might want to consider, and maybe some of us can apply our knowledge and skills to looking into those?
Yeah, massive. I mean, the nightmare of writing a book, and I kind of want to shoot myself half the time these days, is I mean, I'm never going to write a book about myself again. Never going to write a book myself into a book again, because it was really painful writing about my story, and a lot of the book is about me. But also because you have all these conversations once your book's published, and you realize all the things you could and should have put in the first place, and you missed, frankly. So I spent the last 6 weeks just kicking myself the whole time. I mean, having worked out the perfect title for the book, having worked out stories like the AI and joke platform, I wish I could have put it in. What's hidden in plain sight today? Well, many, many, many things. One thing that is hidden in plain sight in more broadly in society is a lack of conversation about the debt burden, and the fact that it's going to be completely impossible to repay debt without some kind of implosion or default, either overt or implicit at some point. And that applies to people's pension systems and things like that. Another thing that's hidden in plain sight is the degree to which we're ignoring, what's happening in the AI world, and the fact you've got concentrated power in a tiny group of people's hands yet again, in a way that's quite alarming. What's hidden in plain sight is the fact that although people are obsessively tracking the US economy, if you live in America, as I do now, and how it is or is not rebounding from the pandemic, there's, searing pain in many parts of the emerging markets right now that's getting comprehensively ignored. I could go on and on. Another thing that's, hidden in plain sight for me was that, in all honesty, I hadn't realized until I finished my book that most of the people, the researchers that I quote, unfortunately, are white. I have very low level of non-white academics, anthropologists, whose work I cite and quote. I hadn't actually realized just how unrepresentative that was of populations as a whole. Is partly a function of the nature of anthropology. I'm concerned that I somehow had my own biases there. But that's another thing that's hidden in plain sight that anthropologists need to talk about is, what is the diversity in our own profession? And the answer is not great. It's even worse in journalism, I should say, certainly in business journalism.
That's when you put it all that way, it really strikes me it was a little bit like when you talked about Donald Trump. To understand Donald Trump, I was thinking as you were just talk about being hidden in plain sight, the whole analogy with the worldwide wrestling, and the way he talked, the way he called people nicknames, made nicknames up for people, all of that. As I was reading it, I thought, why didn't I see that? I mean, we made fun of Donald Trump. As you said, we were making fun of him, or not all of us, but some people were making fun of him, and we missed it. We simply missed it. And that's why I think, and the story that you tell about Kit Kat, that's in plain sight. You just have to be looking for it. And so I think to me, that's a really rich part of the book too. It's listening and observing closely and seeing what you would otherwise miss.
Yeah, and one thing I can't stress is I try and list a lot of my mistakes in the book where I've got things wrong as a journalist, and I've got things wrong very badly. Like I called the Brexit vote wrong. I've called many things wrong, and I've been blind myself. And when I've been blind, it's usually because I have forgotten to try and use that anthropology, method of stepping out of myself and trying to look back at myself and see all the ways that I have been wrong. And journalism. The problem with, the great thing about journalism is you operate very fast, you have a big megaphone often, you have an ability to reach lots of people. The bad thing about journalism is that you can do that because you're operating very fast, you're communicating very quickly, you end up with stupid stereotypes sometimes, and you can end up without the time to reflect or to collide with the unexpected and to try and listen to silences. And I know that I have often been not so much lazy, but just too darn busy to keep that open and inquiring mind that is a hallmark of anthropology.
Yeah, well, it's hard to be an anthropologist 24/7. It's exhausting. I have an on switch and an off switch. Sometimes I don't see anything. Sometimes my lateral vision is fully functioning. I have one more question, and then we're going to go to the people that are watching. And this is the chapter, A Letter to Anthropologists, which was, I can't say that it was my favorite chapter in the book, but it was awfully close to my favorite chapter in the book. And I think anybody who's been an anthropologist working in business, reading this book, can read that chapter and will say, yeah, I know she's not talking exactly to us, but she's telling us how to talk to the people that we want to talk to. And that makes a big difference. And so my question really is, you really implore us to get better at hustling our ideas. And that's the phrase you use. And I love that phrase. And I have to, I should do it myself. Others should do it. When some of us try to reach out a little more broadly, some of our academic writing, or not even academic writing, our more general audience writing tends to be a little heavy-handed. You write for the Financial Times. You're reaching a very general audience. Not all of us, obviously, are employed by the Financial Times or a similar publication. What suggestions do you have for the people listening that are and watching that would help us do better at hustling our ideas out there?
Well, if you're going to be writing, there are tricks of the trade you can learn about how to write clearly. There are books out there which will tell you that. It's about basically using obviously short words, trying to write sequentially. Instead of writing, a lot of academic writing is A leads to Z, leads to K, leads to D, leads to F, leads to W. Effective writing for a mainstream audience is A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, and possibly you might play around with F and G at the end of it. Right. But straightforward, simple, powerful writing is absolutely essential. Point one. Point two is that trying to play what I call the domino game with people in communication style. And by that, I don't mean dominoes in the sense of plastic pieces all toppling over. I mean that the thing about dominoes is that you have a plastic piece with two halves on, and you try and match one half with someone else's piece, but the other half can be different. And this applies as much to journalism in an age of tremendously polarized media as it does to anyone else, is that you need to recognize that if you're trying to communicate controversial, different, surprising ideas to people, they're not going to read it at all if it's completely alien or makes them defensive or doesn't connect in some way. You have to find some half of your domino to connect to someone else's domino to hook them into a story. And you can do that by appealing to some human element. You can do it through surprise or shock. You can do it by tapping into some stereotype. You can do it by actually trying to connect with them through anything else. But you can pull them in and then take them someplace different. So sometimes, actually playing with people's stereotypes initially and then debunking that stereotype can be effective. So that's the sort of broad point about writing. The other points, though, about getting your ideas out is trying to carve out the time. I know it's hard to plunge into the mass market maelstrom, whether that's through things like Writing for the Conversation, which I think is a fabulous publication. Strongly recommend anybody who has an academic perch to try and do that, whether it's platforms like Sapiens, which I think are great, whether it's simply trying to write for your local paper or your local outlet. Anything you can do to just simply take that message out more broadly, I think is very powerful. And yes, you may have to make some compromises and pander into a stereotype at the top and use the word tribal on occasion or ritual, even though anthropologists often hate using that because it sounds like pandering to stereotypes about Indiana Jones. But once you pull people in that way, you can then start saying, well, listen, let's unpack it and actually bring the layers and the nuances in with it as well.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Before
I really want to think about how, in a sense, you have to go with the flow. I don't really know, but there's actually two entirely different. The cover for my book in the UK market and the US market is completely different. Okay, so in the UK market, I have this cover, which is nice and subtle and faintly academic, and it's got me in big letters all over it saying Financial Times, because in the UK market, the Financial Times is quite a big deal. And in the US market, they have it like this, because for American publishing groups, bright red cells, you've got to look aggressive and forceful, etc., etc. In the US market, I had a series of photographs taken, and the one the publisher chose, is this one, which you can probably see, which is me looking a bit like a Fox TV babe, faintly aggressive, staring at the camera, etc., etc.
Right.
The UK publishers vetoed that completely. They said, over our dead bodies, do you use that in the UK market? So in the UK market, we have a picture which works very well in the UK, in places like New Zealand, etc., which is that kind of nice, and frankly looks far more like me than the Fox TV babe one, but nice and unthreatening, looking faintly vague and ditzy, sitting on my stoop in the mornings. Neither is right or wrong. They're all just in different cultural contexts. Decide just to live with it.
Yeah, I love the way you're leaning in the U.S. version. It's just, maybe that's what we want.
I'm trying to look authoritative and aggressive. Or rather, that's what they chose for me. Meanwhile, in Japan, I'm wearing, of course, a black jacket and white shirt,
right,
and looking almost expressionless.
That's great. So, as a reminder to everyone, put your questions in the Q&A, but if they're in the chat, we'll deal with them. So I'm going to open it up to Julia and Matt to report on the questions, and maybe we'll have a few others along the way.
Yeah, so we have one from Camelia. She's asking how Anthro-Vision can help to better understand cryptocurrencies and the new monetary biodiversity. I think
anthropologists actually have more to offer than economists because of several reasons. Basically, anthropology takes social patterns seriously. It takes rituals, performative aspects seriously. Anthropologists know that value is not just created by computer spreadsheets, and that human beings don't operate like algorithms in terms of appraising value, that networks matter, and that the question of how you build trust in systems, whether you have vertical trust or horizontal trust patterns, really, really matters. So for all those reasons, I think anthropology has an incredible opportunity to insert itself into the debate about finance right now through cryptocurrencies. It's a great friend of mine, actually, funny enough, writing a column about this morning. Great friend of mine who teaches cryptocurrencies. He's a brilliant mathematician. He's at MIT. And he said the problem with cryptocurrencies is that the reason why no one understands it is because you have to understand three pools of knowledge: cryptography, obviously, and computer science, economics and finance, but also you have to understand game theory, because if you don't understand game theory, you can't understand what enables people to try and buy into the system and think it has value. And the game theory component is absolutely where anthropologists can jump in. And it's not just about talking about the Yapstones, although the Yapstones is a classic, example of what I would call domino communication style. You start off by talking about Yapstones, which basically, and say to everyone, Bitcoin wasn't the first distributed ledger. The Yapstones in Micronesia, which is 101 anthropology courses, were the first. That panders to the stereotype about anthropology being about Indiana Jones. And then you say, well, actually, this is what it means for the modern world.
Great. And we have a question from Inga. She is interested in externalities and feels that they're rarely reported on or acknowledged. And she's wondering if that's possible.
The answer is they haven't been reported on or acknowledged in the last few decades. But I think ESG is changing that slowly. Climate change issues, are something that almost no company C-suite can ignore right now. There's all this survey evidence, which we report in the FT day in, day out about, which show that. Social issues, gender issues, again, is, beginning to hit the radar screen. And it's very interesting psychologically if you look at what's happened with the whole discussion in carbon emissions around scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Basically, companies started off counting their own carbon emissions inside their companies and their own footprint, and then they looked at their processes. And now they're increasingly looking at what's called scope 3, which is what's happening in their supply chains amongst their customers. And that sort of forced many companies to start widening the lens and realizing they need to think about their footprint in a wider sense and look a bit more at externalities. Walmart's a fascinating example of that. And I tell that story in the book about how, it went from being originally a sort of epitomizing the mom and pop entrepreneurship in America, small town folksy entrepreneurship. It went from that into being this massive global corporation dedicated to efficiency of supply chains, totally ignoring externalities completely. And then in the early years of the 21st century, it realized it had to start at least thinking about its own footprint a bit. So it started thinking about, what might be called scope 1 emissions and some of its most abusive practices. Now, Walmart has a project called Project Gigaton, which is actually trying to not so much reduce emissions inside Walmart, but actually go across the entire supply chain of Walmart and cut emissions in the supply chain by 1 gigaton. So it's really having to have a look at a much wider set of externalities than before. And it's going from that, looking at it in an environmental sense, towards now looking at it in a social sense too. So that does not mean that suddenly externalities are being given their due respect. It does not mean that tunnel vision has ended, but it does mean that that shift is gradually occurring in terms of the cognitive map or the lens. And that creates, again, a chink of opening. I don't want to overstate it, but a tiny opening that I think anthropologists can jump into.
Great, thanks. And so we have a question here, framing anthropology as a position as an outlier, as an outsider, as strengths. So the question is really around, how can we work with business without losing that idea? What can we do to maybe retain some of our essence, but maybe add value?
It's tough. How do you basically maintain that insider-outsider culture? No one's going to, want to have anthropologists on board or inside by becoming complete insiders. I think that, being in touch with, your original tribe of academic anthropologists, trying to step out of yourself, trying to both, go back to dominoes, both integrate and communicate in a way that's effective, while also retaining that sense of detachment. That's the secret of it, if you can. It's not easy, but that's got to be the goal.
Great. And one from Phil. So public discourse about human science issues is often shaped by people who are not human science experts. A recent example of this is the current debate in the US about critical race theory. Are there any resources beyond writing talent that journalists and thought leaders from industry leverage to shape public discourse about issues like this?
In terms of talking about critical race theory, I'm wary of talking too much about critical race theory because I'm not an expert on it. And it's something which I think is incredibly highly charged a discussion right now, extremely important, but something which I say I haven't spent as much time as I could have done or should have done thinking about. And so I admit that up front. However, I'll say two things. Firstly, that looking at the embedded structures of systems is absolutely one of the things that anthropology could and should be doing. Recognizing the value of human beings and our own biases towards each other, essentially the 101 of cultural relativism is absolutely something that, anthropology should be doing. And I think one reason why it's helpful to look at the history of anthropology right now is to see that as a backdrop to the framing of critical race theory and realize that, we've gone from, in the same way we've gone from a, cognitive map where we assumed that human beings evolved in one direction only, that we've assumed that culture were basically rigid boxes with boundaries that couldn't move and which could be stacked in a hierarchy of value. Those kind of ideas which were taken for granted in the late 19th century, early 20th century, as people like Charles King have illuminated, they're now seen as being, completely unacceptable. In the same way, many of the ideas that we had in the late 20th century about even well-meaning liberal people about race, I suspect, will seem outdated in another 100 years.
And just sort of building on that question, aside from the aspect of, what you bring to writing and say the examples you gave earlier about like writing practice and ways to communicate effectively, is there anything else you see, given your position, that helps you communicate ideas, whether that's, maybe speaking publicly or the way you deliver a message, verbally? Is there anything else besides the writing that you leverage to really get an idea out there?
Well, trying to find, short, sharp, snappy wrappers for ideas, trying to tell a bit of a personal story, trying to add some color and drama, trying to create what they call narrative and tension in writing. It's sort of something you learn if you're doing long form journalism. Every long form piece over about 1,000 words needs to have a why or tension at the beginning that you then resolve just to keep people reading. Those are all tricks of the trade. Doing television is obviously powerful, podcasts, videos, multimedia, that kind of stuff. But I'm learning all the time about how to do this. And I'm very happy to engage with people about how to do it. And I'm also learning about how to constantly sort of try and look back at myself and challenge my own biases, which I don't always do effectively, but I need to.
And I'm going to summarize one more from the Q&A, and then Louis, I see there's a few in the chat, so maybe I'll turn it over to you. But there's a few here about teaching, so I'm just going to kind of summarize and be brief about it. But what does academia need to do in terms of teaching anthropology for the future or the next generation, if you will?
Well, I'm not an academic, so I would hesitate to give hard and fast, advice to academics. But I'd say things like recognize and uphold the value of applying anthropology to non-academic fields. Recognize that there's absolutely a role and value to academia for being a repository of knowledge. And I wish there was more academic research that was actually brought into public policy debates. That's kind of what Sapiens is trying to do, or the conversation. And that's one reason I totally support and applaud what they're doing. Recognize that, anthropology is often very powerful when mixed with other disciplines. So anthropology plus medicine, that which is one of the combinations that's probably been most effective at being, promulgated. Anthropology plus economics, anthropology plus computer science. I think that the 21st century is going to be a time when people really want to blend computer science skills with social science skills. And to go back to the cryptocurrency example, I mean, in a world where you basically need to have, a combination of cryptography, economics, and game theory to understand what's going on, this is a really interesting moment for academics to be re-examining the way that they operate as well. It's incredibly hard because universities are structured around silos, around departments. Tenure structure is embedded in this idea. And I often joke that, journalists and media organizations create the silos that reflect the world that existed 10 years ago. So, at the FT, after 2000, the year 2001, a year later, we created what we called a TMT team, a technology, media, and telecommunications team, which we put a lot of resources into, literally a year after the bubble burst. And of course, they wrote lots of tech stories the next 2 or 3 years, but of course, tech was then going down. We had, after 2008, a massive great Wall Street reporting team because that had been the big crisis. Today, it's actually about private capital, not public capital. And again, there's a challenge about how you cover it. So media groups tend to create these silos that existed 20 years ago or 10 years ago. I think academics create the ones that existed 20 years ago and get even more deeply embedded and hardened in those silos. And it's very hard to dismantle. That is what I think needs to happen.
I think this is a good actually segue to some of the questions I see in chat. Part of what you're saying, Gillian, in kind of the broader conversation that we're starting here is it's a question of language we as professionals use, as well as a language we as academics use. I'm even curious, for instance, how can business schools do better in helping train their students in using different kinds of language to imagine the business possibilities? So one panelist actually asked a question along those, one participant asks a question along those lines. So the question is this: how do you reconcile the evolutionary trajectory of colonial anthropology with something like the financial vocabulary of growth that economists use, right? And the kind of language that we're introduced to in business settings and in business programs as well?
Well, I think you can, as an anthropologist, make several points. Firstly, that epistemological frameworks, which are dominant at any one point in history and which seem inevitable and natural and permanent to the participants, rarely are. And just as everyone thought that it was obvious back in the late 19th century that societies evolved from being primitive, natives, savages, all the words that we use then, into, civilized societies, that was taken for granted in the late 19th century. Then it became very clear in the 20th century that was not a set of labels that made sense or could be justified. So too, I expect that insofar as economics is based around the presumption that permanent growth is a natural state always, that you can essentially create models that treat people like rational, detached atoms that don't interact with each other, and have entirely consistent behavior and entirely consistent perspective on the future, rational expectations. Again, that idea, which was so dominant in economics, is not a natural permanent assumption. It needs to be challenged. Insofar as economists tend to assume that monetary transactions are the only ones that really matter enough to be put into models, and that everything that matters has to be expressed as a monetary transaction. All of those three ideas have flourished in the last few decades in economics. They have a role, they are useful, but they are also of their time, and they're not all encompassing. And they're all basically, if you look at the totality of society, they can be wrong. The rise of the tech sector today is run off barter, not monetary transactions, because essentially there's a massive exchange going on of data for services. But that's not within the framework that economists can use to look at the world. This idea that somehow you can ignore externalities we've talked about already, but that's forcing economists to rethink how they operate. And this idea that, individual economic players are somehow detached from each other is simply, again, 2008 showed that was simply wrong. People aren't rational or behave according to rational expectation models all the time. Again, one of my favorite quotes that I learned about after I published my book, but I wish I'd put it in, was Richard Feynman, the physicist, said once apparently that physics would be impossible if the atoms could talk to each other. The reason why people can do physics is because the atoms don't talk to each other. And of course, finance used Newtonian physics models for a long time, assuming that the atoms didn't talk to each other. And they do. So I think the main value of anthropology, or one value, is to tell economists the assumptions you hold and were trained in are useful. They're not the only answer. They may change over time because they have before.
If I could just jump in, thanks for the topic on the history, of the meaning of the word data and on barter. That was particularly interesting as somebody who comes from the technology world and later moved into anthropology. So since you brought it up, I'd like to just ask, is there anything else that you're seeing, again, kind of given the people you get to talk to, where there's maybe an interesting model in tech that's presenting itself, as an opportunity to make that exchange a little fairer?
You mean, because one of the arguments in my book, those who haven't read it, is basically that there is this whole explosion of the tech sector based around barter, this exchange of data for services. And barter is not the perfect word or frame at all, because barter normally implies some sense of self-conscious haggling. But in a world where there's no other easy way to describe what's going on, because you can't call it a sale, you can't call it a gift. I think probably barter is the least bad word to use. And the reason I think we should be using a word like barter is to explain what's happening in a positive sense, to really show why it matters and why it's so big. At the moment, people talk about these exchanges in a negative sense, i.e. as free in the absence of money. And anything that's defined by an absence, a negative, tends to be discarded. And that's exactly what's happened much of the time. And the other reason we need to talk about it as a barter is to show that it's actually a two-way exchange. So, everyone focuses on the theft, if you like, of data from individuals and the privacy implications of that, which are quite right, they should be focused on, but they don't focus on the other side of the equation, which is that people are getting free services. And people like free services and find it pretty efficient to get access to free services through the barter trade, which is one reason why it's stayed in place. And until you recognize that, it's very hard to then start dealing with solutions to try and create a better form of a better tech system. My hunch is that most people, if you ask them, would you like to remediate these exchanges with money, would probably say no, because it's inefficient. Actually, this direct swap is more efficient. Terrible irony that barter didn't disappear as the economists once thought. It's actually been flourishing in the 21st century. But I think people do want to change the terms of trade of barter trade to make them give consumers more power and make them more, fair, if you like. And that means transparency. That means having transparency that consumers can actually make sense of. It's no good just having the entire contract published. People need to understand the implications of it. It means transparency about, what the data is going to be used for, how long it will be used for. But it also means, most crucially, giving consumers a choice about who they cut deals with. And the only way you can do that is to give them portability of data and enable them to move between different providers. And in the financial sector, they do that already. Banks are required, and the onus is on them, not the consumer, to let consumers shift accounts if they want, whenever they want, and take their money with them. In the same way, tech companies should be required, and the onus should be on them to shift data service providers, simply and easily. And then you'll start getting competition, and that competition is what will give the consumers real power.
Great.
I mean, regulation can help too. I'm not in any way saying it's either or, but both aspects, I think, is what's needed.
Great. I have another question from the chat, from the Q&A, I should say, or do you have any others that you want to?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, man.
So one reason that anthropologists struggle with talking about concepts such as culture is that they try to pack everything in, where sociologists seem happy to find a starting point and allowing the conversation to evolve. Your thoughts?
I think that's a very fair point. I mean, both the strength and the weakness of anthropology is it tries to take a holistic view. And often people don't want a holistic view up front. They want actually a streamlined focus and answers. And that again comes back to this domino theory, that I think if you're going to communicate with people, you probably need to start with that. What I try to do when I talk to anthropology about business people is often try and give examples first, and then work from the specific to the more general, and show what it means. I'm talking about something like Facebook, or talking about cryptography, or talking about what's happened in the pandemic, and how anthropology could and should have helped in a practical way to understand, say, mass culture. I think it's often more effective than trying to say to people in general, this is what anthropology can do. And frankly, again, maybe I wrote my book wrongly. Maybe I should have basically gone from the much more specific to the general, rather than sort of made a plea for anthropology. But this is my kind of one big, outpouring of why I think the discipline I got raised in can be useful.
And I think everybody here will agree that you did a wonderful job at that. So thanks for the book and all the effort. I don't have any more questions over here. Bob, you anything?
Yeah, we could keep Gillian probably all night, but she may have a few other things to do. So Gillian, I want to thank you. This was absolutely fabulous. For anyone who wants to hear Gillian in other ways, I think you can search her on Google. The ultimate example of I suppose it's a kind of barter. I think of it as generalized reciprocity. I look at Google as free, and I don't think about what I'm giving them. So I'm sort of deaf and dumb and blind when it comes to that, which is a whole other discussion. But I think you can find Gillian answering other questions and doing other interviews for other kinds of target audiences. So if you watch Gillian's Q&A and conversation on MSNBC, it's fascinating because you're speaking in a very different way. And I think that's really instructive to all of us. This has been a little more specific and specialized, and I think that's been fine and very productive. So thank you very much.
Well, can I say thank you, and thank you very much. I mean, not just for hosting me, but also thank you for what you've done as a network to try and really push the debate forward. I very much salute it. As some of you know, the work that many of you have done has been very influential. It helped to inspire a lot of stories in the book. It helped me to kind of really feel that there was a point in trying to continue to write the book. So I really owe a big debt of gratitude to all of you who have taken part in conversations over the years. So thank you to all of you. And I know also, Bob, you had that great seminar, which again was very helpful. And lastly, I'll just say that if anyone's not seen Greg Urban's book and the one he's written with other people, it's a terrific book, really is. I salute it, and would urge you all to really listen in when they're talking in a couple of weeks' time.
Great. All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending. We appreciate it. Gillian, again, thank you so much.
Thank you
So much.
Thanks, Gillian.